Smoke curls, a body falls, and Nero Wolfe faces whispers at the Copper Lounge. Welcome to the Silent Clue Works. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your voices matter. Let's begin. The doorbell rang at 10:47 on a Tuesday morning in October, which was 17 minutes before Nero Wolfe would descend from the plant rooms on the roof of the brownstone on West 35th Street. I was at my desk in the office, ostensibly working on the books, but actually contemplating the dismal state of our bank balance and wondering if Wolfe's orchids might be edible in a pinch. The rain outside was doing its best impression of a broken faucet, steady and annoying, the kind of weather that makes even optimists consider moving to Arizona. I walked down the hall and opened the front door to find a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair, pulled back severely, and eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep in several days. She wore a charcoal business suit that had probably looked crisp when she put it on, but now suggested she had been pacing in it for hours. Under one arm, she carried a leather portfolio that she clutched like a life preserver. "I need to see Nero Wolfe," she said without preamble. Her voice was steady but had an edge to it, like someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say but wasn't entirely convinced it would work. "He's occupied at the moment," I said. "I'm Archie Goodwin. If you want to tell me what this is about, I can decide whether it's worth interrupting him or whether you should make an appointment for sometime next month." She studied my face for a moment, apparently trying to determine if I was being sarcastic or merely unhelpful. "My name is Claire Donovan. I manage a jazz club in the village called the Copper Lounge. Last night, one of my musicians was murdered in the club. The police have arrested my assistant manager, but they've got the wrong person. I need Mr. Wolfe to prove it." I looked at her more carefully. She didn't strike me as the hysterical type, and she certainly didn't look like someone who made a habit of dramatic pronouncements. She looked like someone who had spent the night staring at a very real problem and had finally decided to do something about it. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. I led her to the office and offered her the red leather chair. She sat on the edge of it, still clutching the portfolio. "Mr. Wolfe will be down in about 10 minutes, I said. "You can wait, or you can tell me the details, and I'll decide if it's something he'd be interested in. Fair warning, though, he's particular about his cases, and he charges accordingly." "I'll wait," she said, "but I can give you the outline. The victim was Tommy Farrell, our trumpet player. He'd been with us for 2 years, talented, reliable, well-liked by everyone. After the last set last night, he went back to the dressing room to pack up his instrument. 20 minutes later, one of my waiters found him dead. He'd been stabbed once, just below the ribs. The knife was still there, one from our kitchen. And the police arrested your assistant manager because? Paul Hendricks. They found his fingerprints on the knife handle. Paul admits he handled it earlier in the evening when he was helping in the kitchen during a dinner rush, but he swears he didn't kill Tommy. I believe him. Paul's worked for me for 5 years. He's honest, dependable, and he had absolutely no reason to want Tommy dead." I heard the familiar sound of the elevator descending and glanced at my watch. "Right on schedule." A moment later, Nero Wolfe entered the office. He moved with his usual deliberate care, crossed to his desk, and lowered his considerable bulk into the custom-built chair. He arranged himself, adjusted a pen on his desk, and then looked at Claire Donovan with half-closed eyes. "Good morning," he said. "I understand you have a problem." She repeated her story, adding details. The Copper Lounge seated about 60 people and featured a 5-piece jazz ensemble. Besides Tommy on trumpet, there was Leonard Marsh on piano, Iris Calloway on saxophone, plus a bassist and drummer. The club employed a bartender, 2 waitstaff, a cook, and Paul Hendricks as assistant manager. The night of the murder, they'd hosted a private party that ran until midnight. After the last set, most patrons had left, but a few lingered at the bar. Tommy had gone to the small dressing room behind the stage, accessible through a narrow hallway. When the waiter went to tell him someone wanted to buy him a drink, he found Tommy on the floor, Wolfe listened without interruption, his fingers interlaced over his middle. When she finished, he said, "You've described what happened. Now tell me why you believe your assistant manager is innocent." "Because I know him, and because there were other people with better reasons to want Tommy dead. Tommy was having an affair with Leonard Marsh's wife. Leonard found out 2 weeks ago. There was a confrontation, but I thought I'd smoothed it over. Maybe I was wrong. Then there's Iris Calloway, our saxophonist. She and Tommy used to be involved, and it ended badly. Professional on the surface, but there's still tension. And Martin Cross, a regular customer who'd been pushing Tommy to leave the band and go solo, offering to finance it. Tommy turned him down, and Martin didn't take it well." Wolfe closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he opened them and looked at me. "Archie, what's our current financial situation?" "Precarious," I said, "but not desperate." He turned back to Claire Donovan. "My fee is substantial. $10,000. Half now, half when the matter is resolved. I require complete cooperation and absolute candor. Can you manage both the fee and the conditions?" Without hesitation, she opened her portfolio, wrote a check and handed it to me. "When do we start?" "Archie will visit your establishment this afternoon," Wolfe said. "Say nothing to anyone about engaging my services. If the guilty party knows I'm involved, they may become cautious." After she left, I returned to find Wolfe sitting with his eyes closed, his lips pushing out and in. "Taking this one?" I asked. "The police are lazy," he said. "I dislike lazy police. Go to the club. Learn everything." The rain had stopped, and suddenly the day looked considerably brighter. By 3 o'clock I was standing under a weathered green awning that read "Copper Lounge" in letters that had once aspired to elegance and now settled for legibility. The village street was narrow and still damp from the morning rain, with a kind of atmosphere that made tourists feel bohemian and bohemians feel commercial. Inside, the club wore its daytime face, which was considerably less flattering than its evening persona. The air carried traces of old smoke, spilled liquor, and the lingering ghosts of last night's music. A man in his 40s stood behind the curved bar, methodically polishing glasses. He had receding hair, tired eyes, and the look of someone who had been expecting bad news and wasn't disappointed when it arrived. He glanced up as I approached. "We're closed until 6, he said. "Unless you're here about Tommy, in which case I've already told the police everything I know, which wasn't much to begin with." "I'm here about Tommy," I said. "But I'm not police. Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. Claire Donovan hired us to look into what happened." He set down the glass carefully. "Paul Hendricks. I'm the assistant manager, and I suppose you've heard I'm the one who supposedly killed him." "That's the current theory. What's your version?" Paul's mouth tightened. "My version is that I was closing out the register when Tommy got stabbed. My version is that I helped in the kitchen earlier and touched the same knife half the staff handles every night. My version is that the police needed someone to arrest, and I was convenient. Show me where it happened." He led me past tables still askew from the previous night, toward a narrow hallway behind the small stage. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, with a door to the kitchen on the right and the dressing room straight ahead. I poked my head into the kitchen first. It was compact but efficient, with a magnetic knife strip on the wall showing an obvious gap. "That's where the murder weapon came from?" I asked. 8-inch chef's knife. I used it around 9:30 to slice bread for the dinner orders. So did Louise, our cook, and probably Claire when she helped during the rush. The police took the whole strip to compare fingerprints. The dressing room was barely larger than a closet. A cracked mirror, a row of hooks with jackets still hanging, a shelf cluttered with musical accessories, and one battered trumpet case sitting open. A chalk outline on the worn linoleum marked where Tommy Farrell had died. The room felt cramped and sad, the kind of place where dreams went to change clothes. "Police find anything useful?" I asked. They took the knife, Tommy's blood-stained shirt, and anything else that looked promising, but they missed something. Paul pointed to the trumpet case. Tommy was obsessive about that horn. After every set, he'd clean it, wrap it in a velvet cloth, and pack it away like it was made of gold. When I saw him after, the cloth was on the floor and his sheet music was scattered. Tommy never left his music messy, suggesting someone was looking for something. Or there was a struggle. Tommy wasn't a big man, but he wasn't going to stand still for a knife in the ribs either. We returned to the main room where 3 people had arrived for what Claire had diplomatically called a meeting. At the piano sat a thin man with nervous hands and the pallor of someone who hadn't slept well. Leonard Marsh, the cuckolded husband. At a table near the stage, a woman with striking features and an attitude that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly. Iris Calloway, the ex-girlfriend. Standing by the bar, checking an expensive watch with obvious impatience, was a heavy-set man in a suit that cost more than most people's cars. Martin Cross, the disappointed investor. I started with Leonard. "You're the piano player and the wronged husband." He flinched. "What happened between Tommy and my wife was unfortunate, but it was over. We were working through it. I didn't kill him." "Where were you when he died?" "At the bar, having a drink. Frank saw me there. I never went near the dressing room after the last set." I turned to Iris Calloway. She was smoking a cigarette and watching me with cool amusement. "You're the saxophone player and the former romantic interest." "Former being the key word," she said. Her voice was husky and confident. "Tommy and I were ancient history. If I'd wanted him dead, I wouldn't have waited 3 years to do it. I was outside having a smoke when it happened. The doorman can verify that." Martin Cross stepped forward without waiting to be addressed. "I don't see why I need to be here. I was a patron, not a suspect. I offered Farrell a legitimate business opportunity. He declined. End of story." "What kind of opportunity?" "Solo career, recording contract, real money instead of playing backup in a basement. He turned me down flat yesterday afternoon. Said he was loyal to Claire and the band. Foolish loyalty, but hardly a motive for murder." I was at my usual table when the commotion started. I looked at the 3 of them, noting the careful way they avoided each other's eyes. Jealousy, rejection, and wounded pride made a nice collection of motives. But something felt rehearsed about their answers, as if they'd all agreed on the same script. "One more question," I said. "Did anyone notice anything else unusual about the dressing room, besides the body and the scattered music?" They exchanged glances. Leonard shook his head. Martin looked bored, but Iris frowned thoughtfully. "The lighting," she said finally. "The overhead bulb was off when I looked in, but the mirror lights were on. Tommy always turned off the mirror lights first, then the overhead. He had a routine. But that night it was backwards. Another small disruption, another break in pattern. Wolfe would appreciate that. People who lived by routines died when those routines were interrupted." I thanked them and made my way back toward the entrance, where Claire was waiting with an anxious expression. "Well?" she asked. "Your assistant manager is probably innocent," I said. "But proving it will require more than eliminating him from consideration. Someone in that room is lying, and they're all lying about the same thing." "Which is?" "I don't know yet. But I will." I left the copper lounge and walked back into the grey afternoon, my head full of contradictions and my notebook full of alibis that were probably worthless. The case was starting to take shape, but like a jazz improvisation, I couldn't tell where it was heading until I heard the next few bars. By the time I returned to the brownstone, it was nearly 5 o'clock, which gave me just enough time to hang up my coat and settle into my desk chair before Wolfe descended from the plant rooms. He entered the office, carrying the scent of orchids and that particular air of satisfaction that meant he had successfully avoided thinking about anything unpleasant for the past 4 hours. He arranged himself in his chair, pressed the button for beer, and fixed me with a look that meant business. I waited until Fritz had delivered the beer and withdrawn before opening my notebook. "The Copper Lounge is a small world with big problems," I said. "Your client has assembled a nice collection of suspects, each with sufficient motive and opportunity to stick a knife in Tommy Farrell." "Proceed," Wolfe said, settling back with his beer untouched. I gave him the layout first, the narrow hallway that funneled traffic past the kitchen to the dressing room, making concealment difficult, but not impossible. Then the suspects. Leonard Marsh, nursing his wounded pride and a marriage in shambles, Iris Calloway carrying 3 years of romantic resentment, Martin Cross frustrated by a refused business proposition, and Paul Hendricks conveniently positioned with his fingerprints on the murder weapon. "The dressing room showed signs of search," I continued. "Tommy's sheet music was scattered, his cleaning cloth was on the floor instead of in the case, and the lighting was wrong. Iris noticed that the mirror lights were on, but the overhead was off, which reversed Tommy's usual routine." Wolfe's eyes opened fully at that. "Reversed how?" "Tommy always turned off the mirror lights first, then the overhead. That night, it was backwards. Either he was interrupted mid-routine, or someone else touched the switches after he was dead. Or during," Wolfe murmured. "A man being murdered might well disrupt his own habits. But the scattered music suggests deliberate search. What was the killer looking for?" "That's the question. Paul thinks something might be missing from the trumpet case, but he couldn't say what. The police inventoried everything but weren't looking for absent items." The phone rang. I answered and found myself talking to a detective lieutenant named Rowcliffe, whose charm was roughly equivalent to that of a tax audit. He wanted to know if Nero Wolfe was interfering with police business. I assured him that Mr. Wolfe was occupied with orchids and had no interest in murder cases. Rowcliffe made threats about obstruction of justice. I made observations about police competence. We parted on the terms of mutual contempt. "Rowcliffe sends his regards," I said after hanging up. "He's heard we're involved and wants us to know the case is closed." "Then we are making progress," Wolfe said. "The police become defensive only when they doubt their conclusions. What time does the club open this evening?" 6 o'clock. Return at 8. Observe the staff and patrons in their natural environment. People under stress reveal more than they intend. Also, I want you to plant a seed of uncertainty." "What kind of seed?" "Tell them we know something was taken from the dressing room. Be vague about what, but imply that its recovery is imminent. Watch their reactions." By 8:15, I was back at the Copper Lounge, which had transformed itself from a tired daytime space into something approaching atmospheric. The lights were low, the air thick with smoke and anticipation, and the small stage glowed amber. The band was playing, though the trumpet chair sat conspicuously empty like a missing tooth in an otherwise complete smile. Leonard hunched over the piano with desperate intensity. Iris commanded attention with her saxophone, and the rhythm section held everything together while pretending the hole in the sound didn't exist. Martin Cross occupied his usual table near the stage, nursing a scotch and watching the proceedings with the expression of a man calculating profit margins. Paul Hendricks moved through the room with careful efficiency, hyper-aware that half the customers were studying him for signs of guilt. Claire worked behind the bar, smiling at patrons while her eyes constantly scanned for trouble. During the break between sets, I made my rounds. I found Leonard at the bar ordering a double bourbon, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the glass. "Rough night," I observed. He startled. "It's difficult without Tommy. We're still adjusting to the hole in the sound." "I bet. By the way, Wolfe thinks he knows what was taken from Tommy's dressing room. He's confident he can track it down by tomorrow." Leonard's eyes widened for just a moment before he composed himself. "Taken? I didn't realize anything was missing." "The police missed it, but Wolfe is thorough." I left him digesting that information and approached Iris, who was smoking near the stage entrance. "Nice solo on the ballad," I said. "Thanks. It's harder when you have to fill the space where another instrument should be. Wolf's making progress on the case, I said casually. He's got a lead on whatever went missing from Tommy's belongings. Thinks it might explain everything. She froze with the cigarette halfway to her lips. What went missing? He didn't specify, but he seemed confident it would tie the whole thing together. Iris took a long drag and exhaled slowly. That's interesting. I hope he finds what he's looking for. Finally, I approached Martin Cross, who was holding court with two younger men who looked like they auditioned for muscle roles in B-movies. Mr. Cross, just thought you should know Wolfe is closing in on some missing evidence from the dressing room. He thinks it might explain why Tommy turned down your business proposal. Cross regarded me with flat, cold eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, Goodwin, and I don't appreciate riddles. No riddle, just information. Wolfe thinks whatever's missing represents leverage of some kind. If your employer finds evidence, he should turn it over to the police. Otherwise, he might find himself in an uncomfortable position. I spent the rest of the evening watching ripples spread through the small pond of the Copper Lounge. Leonard kept glancing toward the back hallway. Iris missed two cues, which was unlike her. Cross spent considerable time whispering to his companions while keeping his eyes on me. The seed had been planted. Now I had to wait and see what grew from it. As I walked out into the night air, I felt the distinct sensation that something was about to break loose. The question was whether I would be there to catch it when it fell. The taxi dropped me at the brownstone just after 11, and I walked up the front steps feeling like I'd accomplished something useful. The seed was planted, the reactions were noted, and tomorrow would bring either results or complications. In my experience with Nero Wolfe cases, it was usually both. Fritz had left a plate in the kitchen with a note that Wolfe had retired early, which meant he'd spent the evening reading and thinking instead of watching me work. I made myself a sandwich, reviewed my notes from the evening, and went to bed with the satisfaction of a job reasonably well done. I woke at 6:30 to the sound of Fritz moving around downstairs, which was normal. What wasn't normal was the faint scratch of metal on metal that came from somewhere below my room. I lay still and listened. Nothing. Then it came again, barely audible but definitely there. Someone was working on a lock. I slipped out of bed, grabbed the .38 from my bedside table, and moved to the window. The street looked empty in the gray morning light, no suspicious cars or loitering figures. The sound came again, and this time I placed it. The front door. I dressed quickly and quietly, then crept downstairs. The scratching had stopped. In the front hall, I examined the door and found fresh scratches around the keyhole, thin as hair but bright against the old brass. Someone had been working on our lock, and recently. In the office, everything looked normal at first glance. Wolfe's desk was exactly as he'd left it. My typewriter was covered, the chairs were in their proper positions, but when I sat down at my desk, I noticed that the top drawer was slightly open. I never leave it that way. I pulled it out and inventoried the contents. Everything was there, but the arrangement was wrong. My notebook was on the right side instead of the left, and the paperclips were scattered instead of contained in their small box. Someone had been in the office. They'd been careful, professional, but not quite careful enough. I checked the safe, unopened. The file cabinets were locked and showed no signs of tampering. Whatever our visitor wanted, they'd found it in my desk or given up looking. I made coffee and waited for Wolfe to come down. At 9 o'clock sharp, the elevator descended, and he entered the office carrying his morning orchid, a yellow cattleyard that looked like it was posing for a magazine. He placed it in the small vase on his desk, settled into his chair, and looked at me expectantly. "We had a visitor last night," I said. "Someone with lockpicks and patience. They got into my desk but didn't take anything. Just looked." His face darkened. "Explain." I gave him the details. from the scratching sound to the rearranged drawer contents. He listened without interruption, his fingers drumming silently on the desk blotter. "Intolerable," he said finally. "This room is inviolate. For someone to enter here, to examine our papers, implies either desperation or arrogance. Possibly both. The seed we planted worked faster than expected. Someone's worried enough to take a serious risk." "Indeed. And now they know what we know, which is both more and less than they expected. What was in your desk?" "Notes from yesterday's interviews, the layout of the club, your theory about the missing item from Tommy's case. Nothing they couldn't have guessed, but now they know we're organized about it." Wolfe pressed the button for beer, though it was early even by his flexible standards. "Call Saul Panzer. I want new locks installed today, and I want to know how our visitor accomplished this intrusion." "You think it was one of our suspects?" "I think it was someone with access to professional tools and considerable nerve. The question is whether they acted from knowledge or panic. If knowledge, they are more dangerous than I anticipated. If panic, they are more vulnerable." I called Saul, who promised to be there within the hour. Then I sat back and considered the implications. Someone had violated the sanctity of Wolfe's brownstone, which was roughly equivalent to spitting in church. That person was now on Wolfe's personal list of offenders, which was not a comfortable place to be. At 10 o'clock, Saul arrived with a small satchel of tools and the demeanor of a man who took locks seriously. He examined the front door first, then my desk, then every other potential entry point in the building. His conclusion was professional and disturbing. "High-quality pick set," he said. "Whoever did this has training and experience. The scratches are minimal. The technique is clean. They knew what they were doing and they didn't hurry. I'd guess 10 minutes total, maybe less." "Could you have done it?" I asked. "On a good day, with the right tools. But I wouldn't have left scratches." He looked at Wolfe. "You want new hardware?" "Immediately. And I want to know if any of our suspects has the necessary skills." "I can check backgrounds," Saul said. "Military service, police records, known associates. If one of them has lock-picking experience, I'll find it." After Saul left to purchase new locks, Wolfe sat in silence for several minutes. I could see him working through the possibilities, weighing motives and methods like a chef considering ingredients. "Call Paul Hendricks," he said finally. "Ask him to come here at 2 o'clock. I want to observe his reaction to news of the break-in." "You think he did it?" "I think he's the most obvious suspect and therefore the least likely. But his response will tell us whether he expected this development or whether it surprises him." I made the call. Paul's voice sounded strained but not guilty when I mentioned the break-in. He agreed to the appointment without hesitation, which suggested either innocence or excellent acting ability. "One more thing," Wolfe said as I hung up. "When Mr. Hendricks arrives, tell him we recovered something from the intruder. Be vague about what, but imply it identifies our visitor." "Another seed?" "A different variety. If Mr. Hendricks is innocent, he will be curious. If he is guilty, he will be terrified. And if he knows who is guilty, he will be calculating. Each response will tell us something useful." The morning had started with scratches on a lock and evolved into psychological warfare. It was shaping up to be an interesting day, assuming we survived it. Someone had made the mistake of bringing the fight to Nero Wolfe's doorstep, and that was rarely a winning strategy. Paul Hendricks arrived at 2 o'clock precisely, which suggested either punctuality or the nervous energy of a man who had been pacing for an hour before his appointment. He wore the same tired expression from the club, but his eyes were alert and his hands steady. Fritz showed him into the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk like a judicial mountain, unmoved and unmovable. "Mr. Hendricks," Wolfe said without preamble. "Someone broke into this house early this morning. They picked the front door lock with considerable skill and searched Mr. Goodwin's desk. They were looking for information about our investigation." Paul's face registered genuine surprise, the kind that's difficult to fake and impossible to sustain. Someone broke in here? Who would do that? That is what we intend to determine. The intruder left traces of their presence, small but significant. We recovered something they dropped during their hasty departure. I watched Paul carefully as I delivered the lie. It's not much, but it might identify our visitor. A small personal item, easily overlooked but quite distinctive. Paul leaned forward with obvious curiosity. What kind of item? We're not prepared to specify yet, Wolfe said. But if it belongs to you, this would be an opportune moment to acknowledge it. It doesn't belong to me because I wasn't here. I was at home, probably lying awake worrying about spending the rest of my life in prison. My landlady can verify I never left the building. His indignation seemed authentic. Either Paul Hendricks was innocent, or he deserved consideration for the Academy Awards. Tell me about Tommy Farrell's personal habits, Wolfe continued. Beyond music, what occupied his time when he wasn't performing? Paul settled back in his chair, grateful for safer ground. Tommy was methodical about everything. He had routines, systems. After each set, he'd clean his trumpet, pack it exactly the same way every time, then review his notebook. Notebook? Black leather, about the size of a paperback book. He kept it in his trumpet case, wrote in it constantly. Musical ideas, chord progressions, original compositions. He was secretive about it, protective. Said he was developing his own style, something that would set him apart from every other trumpet player in the city. I felt a small electric charge of recognition. The missing item from the dressing room had just acquired shape and purpose. Did anyone else know about this notebook? Wolfe asked. Everyone knew he kept notes, but Tommy never showed the contents to anyone. He said it wasn't ready yet, that he was still working out the ideas. But he carried it everywhere. Was it listed among his effects when the police inventoried his belongings? Paul frowned, thinking, I don't remember seeing it on their list. I assumed it was there, but now that you mention it. He trailed off, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. The notebook is missing, Wolfe said, which suggests our killer was looking for something specific, not a crime of passion, but a calculated theft disguised as murder. Before Paul could respond, the phone rang. I answered and found myself talking to Saul Panzer. Can you put me on speaker? Saul asked. I've got information Mr. Wolfe should hear. I pressed the button and nodded to Wolfe. Report, Wolfe said. Leonard Marsh has a record. Saul's voice came through clearly. Breaking and entering, 10 years ago. He and a partner were stealing musical instruments from shops around the city. Marsh got 6 months in county jail. The partner got 2 years upstate. Paul's mouth fell open. Leonard? He never mentioned that. People rarely advertise their criminal histories, Wolfe observed. What else, Saul? Martin Cross is cleaner on paper, but he associates with some interesting people. 2 bodyguards with assault records, and he's been seen with a guy named Mickey Doyle, recently released from Sing Sing. Doyle's specialty is locks and safes. Interesting. Continue your investigation. I want to know everything about Mr. Doyle's recent activities. After Saul hung up, Paul sat in stunned silence. Leonard's a thief. I've worked with him for 2 years. He seems so harmless. Appearances deceive, Wolfe said, particularly when people have reasons to conceal their past. However, your reaction suggests you are unaware of his history, which supports your claim of innocence. So Leonard could have broken in here, or Mr. Cross could have employed Mr. Doyle to do so. The question remains, what information were they seeking, and did they find it? The phone rang again. This time it was Claire Donovan, and her voice carried a tremor of barely controlled panic. Mr. Goodwin, something terrible has happened. Someone broke into the club last night after we closed. They tore apart the dressing room, went through everything. The police are here now, but they're not finding anything useful. I covered the mouthpiece and relayed the information to Wolfe. His eyes opened fully, and I saw the predatory gleam that meant the hunt was intensifying. "Tell her we'll be there within the hour," Wolfe said. I uncovered the phone. "We're coming over. Don't let anyone disturb the scene until we arrive." After I hung up, Wolfe pushed himself to his feet with the deliberate effort of a man accepting an unpleasant necessity. "You're actually leaving the brownstone?" I asked. "In the middle of the day. Someone has violated my home and disrupted my investigation. They have now escalated to a second burglary. This person needs to understand that such actions have consequences, and I need to see what they were looking for badly enough to risk exposure." Paul stood as well. "Should I come with you?" "No. Return to your normal routines. Say nothing about this meeting beyond the bare fact that you came here. And observe carefully. People under pressure reveal themselves in small ways. Note them." 20 minutes later, we were in the sedan heading downtown, Wolfe sitting in the back seat like a mountain being transported against its will. The case had shifted from investigation to active pursuit, and someone was about to discover that Nero Wolfe took personal affronts very seriously indeed. The missing notebook had become the key to everything, and now we had to find it before the killer realized we were closing in. The Copper Lounge looked like a battlefield after the surrender. Tables and chairs lay scattered across the floor, and the narrow hallway to the dressing room was blocked by a uniformed officer who looked like he'd rather be directing traffic. Detective Lieutenant Rowcliffe stood near the bar with the expression of a man who had personally been insulted by the existence of crime in his jurisdiction. When he saw Wolfe and me enter, his face cycled through several interesting shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that suggested either high blood pressure or low tolerance for private detectives. "What the hell are you doing here, Wolfe? This is a crime scene, not a tourist attraction." "Miss Donovan retained my services," Wolfe said calmly, settling into the nearest chair that looked capable of supporting his considerable bulk. "I'm here at her request to observe the aftermath of incompetence." Rowcliffe's jaw worked silently for a moment. "There's nothing to observe. Some junkie broke in looking for cash or valuables. Happens in this neighborhood all the time. A junkie who picked the back door lock without leaving scratches, ignored the cash register containing approximately $300, and conducted a methodical search of a specific location. Your junkie shows remarkable discipline and focus, Lieutenant." I left them to their verbal sparring and headed for the dressing room. The destruction was systematic rather than random. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were looking for and had torn the small space apart with professional thoroughness. The trumpet case lay open with its velvet lining slashed. The wall shelf had been pulled down and examined, and even the narrow closet had been emptied completely. But it was the mirror that caught my attention. Unlike the rest of the room, it remained mounted on the wall, though a diagonal crack ran across its surface. I moved closer and noticed tiny white smears along the broken edge, like dried paste. I touched a fingertip to the residue and brought it to my nose. Glue, fresh and recent. "They took something from behind the mirror," I called to Wolfe. "Probably taped to the back in a flat envelope. The adhesive is less than a day old." Wolfe's eyes opened fully. The murderer failed to find the notebook in the initial search. When we began asking questions about missing items, they realized we were converging on the same conclusion. That prompted the break-in at my office. When that yielded nothing, they returned here for a more thorough search. "And found something," I said, examining the frame more carefully. "But not everything they wanted, or they wouldn't have made such a mess afterward." Claire appeared in the doorway, her face pale with exhaustion. "The police want to know if I can identify anything that's missing. But how can I tell what's not here if I don't know what was here to begin with?" "Where else might Tommy have kept personal items?" Wolfe asked. "Beyond this club and his apartment?" "I don't know. He was private about his personal life, but he mentioned having a safe place for important things, somewhere nobody would think to look." After Rowcliffe and his team departed with their usual collection of threats and warnings, we made a brief stop at Tommy's apartment. The fourth-floor walk-up was exactly what you'd expect for a struggling musician. One room, minimal furniture. and a view of nothing in particular. The police had been thorough, but not destructive. I searched while Wolfe recovered from the climb, but found nothing beyond the ordinary detritus of a young man's life. If the notebook was here, someone got to it first, I reported. Or Tommy kept it elsewhere, Wolfe said, breathing heavily from the stairs. Somewhere he considered safer than his home or workplace. Where would a musician hide his most valuable possession? I was examining the trumpet case again, running my fingers along the hinges when I felt something small wedged between the metal and the leather. I worked it free with my penknife, a folded piece of paper, barely an inch square. When I opened it, I found a receipt from the luggage storage facility at Grand Central Terminal, dated the day of the murder and time-stamped 4:15 in the afternoon. Tommy made a stop before coming to the club that night, I said, handing Wolfe the receipt. His eyes lit with the satisfaction of a puzzle piece falling into place. He anticipated trouble. He secured his notebook before arriving at the club, likely because he feared it would be taken from him. This receipt was his insurance policy, hidden where he hoped someone would eventually find it. We drove to Grand Central in tense silence. The station was its usual chaos of humanity in motion, indifferent to our small drama. The luggage storage attendant was bored and efficient, exchanging our receipt for a small gym bag without curiosity about its contents. Wolfe insisted we wait until we were back in the car to open it. Inside, wrapped in a clean shirt, was the black leather notebook that had caused so much trouble, but when Wolfe opened it, we discovered it was more than just musical compositions. Interspersed with the staffs and notes were entries of a different kind: dates, names, and dollar amounts. "It's a ledger," Wolfe said softly, scanning the pages. A record of transactions. Tommy Farrell wasn't just observing, he was collecting. Leonard Marsh, $500, September 15th. Martin Cross, $2,000, October 1st. Iris Calloway, $300, September 28th. Blackmail, I said, or insurance, depending on your perspective. But look at this final entry, dated the day of the murder. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the last page. Final payment, $20,000. Initials only, P.H. Paul Hendricks? Possibly. Or someone else with those initials. Or a deliberate misdirection. But this provides the motive we lacked. Tommy Farrell was dangerous to several people, and one of them decided the price of silence had become too high. We sat in the car as the implications settled around us like dust after an explosion. Tommy hadn't been an innocent victim. He'd been playing a dangerous game with dangerous people. The notebook in Wolfe's hands contained enough secrets to destroy half a dozen lives, and someone had been willing to commit murder to keep those secrets buried. "What's the play now?" I asked. "Now we set the stage for the final act," Wolfe said, closing the notebook with a decisive snap. "Contact all of them: Claire Donovan, Paul Hendricks, Leonard Marsh, Iris Calloway, and Martin Cross. Tell them I have solved the case and require their presence tonight to finalize the details. Mention that the missing notebook has been recovered. That should ensure their attendance. And if they refuse, they won't. Curiosity and fear are powerful motivators. Besides, anyone who refuses marks themselves as guilty. They will come, if only to learn how much we know and how much we can prove." As we drove back to the brownstone, I looked at the notebook resting on Wolfe's knee. Such a small thing to die for, just paper and ink. But it held the power to destroy lives and end careers. Tommy Farrell had thought he was clever, collecting secrets like a magpie collecting shiny objects. Instead, he'd collected his own death warrant. Tonight, in the familiar warmth of Wolfe's office, someone was going to face the music they'd been trying to silence, and this time, there would be no encore. By 8 o'clock that evening, the office had been transformed into a theater of judgment. Wolfe had positioned the chairs with the same precision he applied to his orchid arrangements, each placement calculated for maximum psychological effect. Leonard Marsh faced Wolfe directly, close enough to feel the weight of scrutiny, but too far to find comfort. Iris Calloway sat angled to observe the others, her musician's instinct for reading an audience serving her well. Martin Cross occupied the lower chair that made even large men feel diminished, his expensive suit unable to compensate for the disadvantage. Paul Hendricks sat nearest the door, still technically under suspicion, but beginning to sense the tide turning. Claire Donovan had chosen the red leather chair slightly apart from the others, her position as client separating her from the suspects, even as her anxiety placed her among them. The black notebook rested on Wolfe's desk like a small bomb, its presence dominating the room despite its modest size. I remained at my desk with my own notebook open, ready to record whatever revelations the evening might produce. The silence stretched until it became almost tangible, a living thing that fed on the nervous energy radiating from our guests. Wolfe surveyed his audience with the satisfaction of a conductor facing his orchestra. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. You are here because Tommy Farrell is dead, and because each of you contributed to the circumstances that led to his murder. The police have arrested Mr. Hendricks based on fingerprint evidence, but that arrest represents laziness rather than investigation. The actual killer sits in this room, and before we conclude, that person will be identified and their motive explained. Leonard shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching as if seeking piano keys. Iris lit a cigarette with hands that weren't quite steady. Martin Cross maintained his composure, but a muscle in his jaw flickered. Claire watched Wolfe with the intensity of someone whose future hung on every word. Tommy Farrell was murdered for this notebook. Wolfe continued, tapping the leather cover. It contains more than musical compositions. It documents a systematic program of extortion with dates, amounts, and carefully recorded transactions. Tommy discovered that information was more profitable than music, and he collected secrets the way other men collect stamps. He opened the notebook to a marked page. Mr. Marsh, you paid $500 on September 15th. This was not for musical arrangements, but to ensure your criminal record remained private. More significantly, Tommy knew you had resumed your old profession, taking small amounts from the club's register and petty items that could be sold. Nothing dramatic, but sufficient to violate your parole. Leonard's face crumpled. I needed the money. My wife's medical bills after she found out about Tommy and her, the therapy sessions, the medications. I was desperate, but I never hurt anyone. Desperation rarely leads to murder when it stems from shame, Wolfe observed. You lack the courage for violence, settling instead for theft and fear. He turned to Iris. You paid $300. Tommy possessed photographs from a particularly unfortunate evening 3 years ago when you suffered what the medical profession diplomatically terms a breakdown. Public intoxication, destruction of property, assault on a fellow musician. The incident could have ended your career. Iris exhaled smoke slowly. Tommy was a parasite, but I didn't kill him. I was outside having a cigarette when it happened. You were seen outside, but not continuously observed. However, your temperament argues against premeditation, and the murder required planning. Wolfe's attention shifted to Martin Cross. Your payment was the largest of the regular contributors. $2,000 to conceal your use of Mickey Doyle's services in industrial espionage. Tommy learned that your business success depended partly on information stolen from competitors, obtained through Doyle's lockpicking expertise. Cross's composure finally cracked. Farrell was bleeding me dry. Every month he wanted more. I gave him money to make him go away. Not because I was guilty of anything. An interesting distinction. But your payments ceased after October 1st, didn't they? You refused to continue, which prompted Tommy to make his final, desperate gamble. Wolfe closed the notebook and looked directly at Claire. The last entry is the most revealing. $20,000, dated the day of the murder, with the initials P.H. Mr. Hendricks lacks such resources, making the entry either false or referring to something else entirely. In this case, it represents Partnership Holdings, the shell company through which you and Mr. Cross have been laundering money through the Copper Lounge. Claire's face went white. That's impossible. I run a legitimate business. You run a business that serves Mr. Cross's purposes. The club provides an ideal vehicle for converting questionable income into clean revenue. Tommy discovered this arrangement and demanded $20,000 for his silence. When you refused, he threatened to expose the entire operation to federal investigators. You're guessing, Claire said, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm stating facts. Tommy visited Grand Central that afternoon because he feared for his safety. He had pushed too hard, demanded too much. He secured the notebook because he knew someone might try to take it from him by force. He was correct, but he underestimated the source of the danger. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. You killed him, Miss Donovan. You took a knife from the kitchen during the dinner rush, concealed it until after the last set, then followed Tommy to the dressing room. He trusted you enough to turn his back, and you stabbed him. You searched frantically for the notebook, failed to find it, then called the police and eventually me. Why would I hire you if I was guilty? Claire demanded. Because you needed to control the investigation. You hoped I would clear Mr. Hendricks quickly and direct suspicion toward Mr. Cross or one of the musicians. You never anticipated that I would find the notebook or uncover the money laundering operation. Claire stared at him for a long moment, her composure finally cracking. He was going to destroy everything. The club, my life, 20 years of work. He said he'd give the federal agents enough evidence to shut us down and send me to prison. He wouldn't listen to reason. So you killed him. I had to. The words came out as barely a whisper. He left me no choice. I couldn't let him ruin everything I'd built. The confession hung in the air like smoke from Iris's cigarette. I reached for the phone to call Inspector Kramer, knowing that another case had reached its inevitable conclusion. Wolfe sat back in his chair, his expression showing neither satisfaction nor regret, merely the quiet completion of a task properly done. The music had stopped, the final note played, and justice would now follow its own rhythm toward resolution. Inspector Kramer arrived within 20 minutes, bringing 2 uniformed officers and Detective Rowcliffe, whose expression suggested he was already composing his report on private detective interference. He listened to Claire's confession with the weary professionalism of a man who had heard too many such admissions, examined the notebook with careful attention to its evidentiary value, and then supervised her arrest with the courtesy accorded to killers who surrendered without drama. Before the officers led her away, Claire turned to Wolfe with something approaching respect. How did you know about the money laundering operation? Tommy's notebook didn't contain those financial details. It contained sufficient evidence, Wolfe replied. The final entry of $20,000 was far beyond the scope of ordinary blackmail among musicians. Such a sum suggests existential threat, the kind that accompanies federal prosecution. Your reaction to Tommy's demand confirmed that the stakes involved more than personal embarrassment. A jazz club with modest attendance cannot support your evident lifestyle unless it serves purposes beyond entertainment. Claire nodded slowly, as if finally understanding the scope of her exposure. He was going to destroy everything, 20 years of work, gone because of one greedy musician who couldn't leave well enough alone. Mr. Ferrell made poor choices, Wolfe said, but murder was yours alone. After the police departed with their prisoner, the remaining occupants of the office sat in stunned silence. The revelation had stripped away pretenses, leaving each person to contemplate their own vulnerabilities. Leonard Marsh looked like a man who had received an unexpected reprieve from execution. Iris Calloway stubbed out her cigarette with unnecessary force, her musician's composure finally cracking. Paul Hendricks remained seated as if he had forgotten how to stand, the weight of false accusation slowly lifting from his shoulders. Martin Cross was the first to recover his equilibrium. He adjusted his expensive suit and regarded Wolfe with the calculating expression of a businessman reassessing a potential threat. "What happens to the notebook now?" he asked. "It becomes evidence in multiple investigations," Wolfe said. The murder case is resolved, but the financial crimes documented within will attract federal attention. I suggest you consult competent legal counsel regarding the entries that concern your activities." Cross's jaw tightened. "You've made a dangerous enemy tonight, Wolfe. Men in my position don't forget interference in their business affairs." "I have made no enemy at all," Wolfe replied without opening his eyes. "I have merely identified a murderer and recovered evidence of various crimes. If you choose to interpret the pursuit of justice as personal antagonism, the fault lies in your conscience rather than my actions. Good evening, Mr. Cross." After Cross departed with his bodyguards trailing like expensive shadows, Paul Hendricks finally found his voice. "I'm actually free. The charges will be dropped. The police will process your release once the paperwork is completed," I said, "though you might want to consider new employment. The Copper Lounge's future looks uncertain." "I don't care about the club anymore," Paul said, extending his hand to Wolfe. "I just want my life back. Thank you for proving my innocence." "Miss Donovan paid our fee," Wolfe said. "Justice requires no additional compensation." Leonard and Iris lingered after Paul left, both looking lost without the structure of mutual suspicion to support them. "What about us?" Iris asked. "You exposed our secrets to everyone in this room." "I exposed nothing that wasn't already documented by Mr. Farrell," Wolfe said. "Whether those revelations spread beyond this office depends on the discretion of those present. Your personal failings are matters of private shame rather than public concern. I have no interest in broadcasting them further." Leonard cleared his throat nervously. "The band is finished, isn't it? Without Tommy, without Claire, without the club itself." "Music survives individual musicians," Wolfe observed. "Find another venue, recruit another trumpet player, and continue performing. The alternative is to let Tommy Farrell's death claim more victims than necessary." After they departed, I secured the front door and returned to find Wolfe sitting with his eyes closed, his fingers interlaced over his considerable middle. The yellow Cattleya still occupied its place on his desk, serene and indifferent to the evening's human drama. "Satisfactory conclusion?" I asked. "Adequate," he said. "The murderer is identified, the innocent are freed, and justice will proceed through appropriate channels. But the case leaves an unpleasant residue. The blackmail scheme, the entire sordid enterprise. Tommy Farrell discovered that fear generates profit and proceeded to monetize the vulnerabilities of those around him. Miss Donovan built her business on illegal foundations and committed murder to protect them. Each participant believed their particular transgression was justified by circumstances, that moral rules applied to others, but not to themselves. Mr. Farrell's notebook documented not merely crimes, but rationalizations, each entry representing someone who chose convenience over integrity. The phone rang, interrupting his philosophical observations. Saul Panza reported that the new locks were installed and tested, the brown stone once again secure against uninvited visitors. "Excellent," Wolfe said when I relayed the information. "I dislike vulnerability. A man's home should remain inviolate against the chaos of the world." Fritz appeared in the doorway to announce dinner. "Duck with cherry sauce, new potatoes, and the salad you requested, sir." Wolfe pushed himself to his feet with evident relief. "Join me, Archie. We have earned sustenance after this evening's exertions." Over dinner, Wolfe's mood improved as it invariably did when food displaced philosophy. He discussed the preparation of the duck with Fritz, debated the merits of various cherry varieties, and consumed 3 helpings with the dedication of a man who believed excellent cuisine represented civilization's highest achievement. "What about Claire's retainer?" I asked as Fritz served coffee. "The balance of $5,000? "Send it to Mr. Hendricks," Wolfe said. "He will need resources to rebuild his life after false imprisonment. Consider it compensation for the indignity of wrongful accusation." Later, as I prepared my final notes on the case, I reflected on Tommy Farrell and the notebook that had killed him. He had been clever enough to recognize opportunities, but not wise enough to understand consequences. He had played a dangerous game with dangerous people and lost, taking Claire Donovan down with him. The Copper Lounge would close, the band would scatter, and eventually another establishment would open in the same space, filled with different people making different mistakes. But the music would continue, as Wolfe had observed. It always did. The next morning brought the kind of crystalline October air that makes even cynics believe in fresh starts, though experience had taught me that optimism before breakfast was usually premature. I was at my desk reviewing the previous night's notes when the phone rang at 9:15. Inspector Kramer's voice carried the particular edge that meant someone had disrupted his orderly universe. "Wolfe there?" he asked without preamble. "Upstairs communing with orchids until 11. What's the crisis?" "Claire Donovan is dead." That got my attention. "Dead how?" "Suicide. Found her in her cell this morning. Hanged herself with strips torn from her bedsheet. Left a note that said, 'I won't give him the satisfaction.' No signature, but it was her handwriting. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. She seemed resigned last night, not suicidal. That's what bothers me. She had a visitor around 9 last night, her lawyer, Arnold Paxton. After he left, she barely spoke to anyone. 3 hours later, she was dead." After Kramer hung up with his usual collection of threats about interference, I sat staring at my notebook. Claire's confession had felt complete, final. People don't usually kill themselves hours after unburdening their conscience unless something changes the equation dramatically. At 11 o'clock, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms carrying his morning orchid, a pale yellow cattleya that looked serene and untouchable. He arranged it in its vase, settled into his chair, and looked at me expectantly. "Claire Donovan committed suicide in her cell early this morning," I reported. "Left a note about not giving him satisfaction. Kramer thinks her lawyer told her something that made dying preferable to living." Wolfe's face darkened. "Arnold Paxton, the man who represented her business interests for 20 years, if he conveyed information that prompted suicide, it concerned more than legal strategy. The notebook implicated Martin Cross in money laundering. Maybe Paxton warned her that Cross had longer reach than she realized. Possibly, but Miss Donovan struck me as pragmatic rather than fearful. She killed to protect her enterprise, not from panic. Suicide suggests she faced consequences worse than prison." The doorbell rang before I could respond. I opened it to find Paul Hendricks standing on the stoop, looking considerably better than when I'd last seen him. The shadow of false accusation had lifted, replaced by something approaching cautious hope. "The charges were dropped an hour ago," he said after I'd shown him to the office. "I wanted to thank you both personally, and to give you this." He placed a small package on Wolfe's desk. "I found it this morning in Tommy's apartment. The landlord let me collect his personal effects, and this was hidden under a loose floorboard." Wolfe unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a second notebook identical to the first but considerably thicker. He opened it and began reading, his eyebrows rising slightly as he progressed through the pages. "Remarkable," he said finally. "Mr. Farrell maintained duplicate records. This contains the actual evidence supporting his blackmail activities. Photocopies of documents, transcribed conversations, photographs. Everything necessary to prove the allegations in the first notebook." After Paul departed with our thanks and a check for $5,000, Wolfe sat examining the second notebook with the intensity he usually reserved for rare orchids. The pages contained meticulous documentation of every crime Tommy had discovered, each entry supported by evidence that would survive legal scrutiny. "The first notebook was the ledger," Wolfe observed. "This is the arsenal. Mr. Farrell understood that accusations without proof were worthless. So we have everything needed to prosecute Cross and the money laundering operation. We have evidence. Whether we can use it depends on factors beyond our control." He pressed the button for beer. Call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ask for Special Agent Harrison. Explain that we have evidence of interstate money laundering that requires federal attention. The call took 20 minutes to complete, navigating bureaucratic gatekeepers before reaching Harrison. He listened to my summary with professional interest and agreed to visit that afternoon. Harrison arrived at 3 o'clock, a lean man with the careful demeanor of someone who had learned not to trust appearances. Wolfe presented the second notebook along with a complete explanation of the case, emphasizing the money laundering operation and its implications. "This is substantial," Harrison said after reviewing the contents. "We've had Martin Cross under surveillance for months, but he's managed to stay just beyond reach. This notebook provides the documentation we've been lacking." "Then you'll pursue prosecution?" "Aggressively. Money laundering falls under federal jurisdiction, and the scope of this operation suggests interstate activity." He secured the notebook in an evidence bag. "I'll keep you informed of our progress." After Harrison departed, Wolfe permitted himself a small smile of satisfaction, but something in his expression suggested the case wasn't quite finished. "There's more, isn't there?" I asked. "Miss Donovan's suicide troubles me. Her note referenced him specifically, not them. If she feared Martin Cross, she would have used his name. The pronoun suggests someone else, someone whose identity she protected even in death. Someone bigger than Cross. Someone who made dying preferable to talking. Cross is ambitious, but not particularly subtle. Miss Donovan's fear suggests a more sophisticated threat." The phone rang. I answered to find Saul Panza reporting that he'd discovered something interesting about Arnold Paxton's client list. The lawyer served on the board of an arts foundation alongside Lionel Carberry, who owned a chain of restaurants and clubs throughout the city. "Carberry," Wolfe repeated thoughtfully. "A man in that position would have multiple venues for laundering money. Miss Donovan's club was merely one pipe in a larger system. And when Tommy demanded $20,000, he thought Claire was the source. But she was just the weakest link in Carberry's chain." "Precisely. When she was arrested, Carberry would have been alarmed. Paxton visits her, conveys his employer's concerns, perhaps his intentions. She leaves that meeting understanding that prison offered no sanctuary from Carberry's reach. Hence the note about not giving him satisfaction. She refused to let him decide how she would be eliminated. She preempted him." Wolfe closed his eyes. "It explains the professional quality of the break-in here. Carberry has resources Cross lacks. So what's the play? We wait. Mr. Carberry will learn that Tommy's notebook survived Miss Donovan's death. His response will determine our next move." As if summoned by Wolfe's words, the phone rang again. This time it was Harrison, his voice carrying urgency. "Cross is talking. He's offering to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. Says he can give us someone much bigger, someone who's been using his operation as a front for a much larger laundering scheme." "Lionel Carberry," I suggested. "How did you know that name?" "Lucky guess. When do you move on him?" "Tomorrow morning. And Wolfe, we may need that second notebook as evidence. Cross's testimony alone won't be sufficient." After I hung up, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence. The case had evolved from simple murder to complex conspiracy, but the essential truth remained unchanged. Tommy Farrell had died because he discovered secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," Wolfe said finally. "Merely justice redirected through more reliable channels." The brownstone settled into its evening routine, but I could feel the tension of unfinished business. Tomorrow would bring federal raids, arrests, and the final unraveling of the network that had killed Tommy Farrell. Tonight, we waited in the calm before the storm, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. The federal raids began at dawn with the methodical efficiency that characterizes government work when properly motivated. By 8 o'clock, Harrison called to report that Lionel Carberry had been arrested at his Park Avenue apartment while attempting to burn documents in his fireplace. Martin Cross, already in custody and eager to negotiate, had provided agents with enough details to dismantle the entire money laundering operation. 7 locations were searched simultaneously, yielding boxes of financial records that would keep prosecutors employed for months. The morning papers treated the story as a financial crime with musical footnotes. Headlines proclaimed the largest money laundering bust in years, while Tommy Farrell and Claire Donovan were reduced to context for the larger narrative. Wolfe read the coverage with distaste, occasionally muttering about journalists who confused complexity with comprehension. "They missed the essential truth," he said, folding the paper with unnecessary force. This began as murder and remained murder throughout. The financial crimes were merely motive dressed in ledgers. Inspector Kramer arrived that afternoon, settling into the red leather chair like a man conceding temporary defeat. "For once, your grandstanding helped more than it hurt. The feds are pleased. Harrison claims you handed him Carberry on a platter." Mr. Harrison exaggerates. "I merely refuse to ignore an obvious implication." Wolfe pressed the button for a burr. "How is Miss Donovan's death being handled?" "As a suicide, because that's what it was. Her lawyer claims she was despondent about prison. You buy that?" "No. She killed to preserve an enterprise, then killed herself to deny her employer control over her fate. Consistency of motive, not despair, explains her final act." After Kramer departed with his usual collection of threats, the doorbell rang again. Iris Calloway stood on the stoop with her saxophone case and an expression of grim determination. "I need to talk to Wolfe about Tommy and what really happened." In the office, she remained standing as if sitting would commit her to something she wasn't ready to accept. "I lied about the cigarette break. I was outside, but not the whole time. I came back in through the kitchen entrance and saw Claire going toward the dressing room with something in her hand. I didn't know it was a knife then, but I knew something was wrong. She looked determined, focused. I should have followed her, should have stopped whatever was about to happen." Wolfe regarded her with patient attention. "Why reveal this now?" "Because Claire is dead and Tommy is dead, and I'm tired of carrying secrets. My silence might have helped convict Paul, and that would have been another death on my conscience. Your testimony would have been useful 3 days ago. Now it merely confirms what we already proved through other means." "I know, but I needed to say it anyway." Later that afternoon, Paul Hendricks called with news that lifted the gloom considerably. "The charges were dropped this morning, and I've decided to reopen the Copper Lounge. Leonard and Iris want to keep playing. We're going to call it Tommy's Place. It seemed right." Harrison's final visit brought the legal details to a close. Cross had received 5 years in exchange for his cooperation. Carberry faced 20 to life on federal charges. The lawyer Paxton, disbarred and desperate to avoid prison himself, had confirmed that he'd visited Claire to deliver Carberry's ultimatum: silence or elimination. She had chosen her own exit rather than wait for his schedule. "The notebook was the cornerstone of our case," Harrison reported. "Tommy Farrell was meticulous. 3 years of documentation, all of it admissible." After Harrison departed, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence. The case had achieved resolution, but something in his expression suggested dissatisfaction with the outcome. "This case demonstrates the limitations of justice," he said finally. "We identified the murderer, recovered the evidence, and facilitated federal prosecution of the larger conspiracy. Yet the true architect of these deaths will likely escape meaningful consequences. Carberry will negotiate reduced charges, serve minimal time, and emerge to rebuild his empire under different names. The law punishes what it can prove, not what it knows." Fritz appeared to announce dinner, squab with wild rice and a bottle of Burgundy that had been waiting for the proper occasion. We ate in companionable silence, the kind that exists between people who have weathered a storm together and emerged intact. The civilized rituals of dining held the sordid details of murder and betrayal at bay for an hour. Back in the office, Wolfe settled into his chair with evident relief. The yellow cattleya still bloomed on his desk, untouched by the chaos that had swirled around it. Tommy Farrell wasn't a hero, I observed, pouring brandy. He was a blackmailer who got greedy, but in the end, his greed served justice better than his conscience ever did. Heroism is often accidental, Archie. Men pursue selfish ends and stumble into noble outcomes. Mr. Farrell sought profit and achieved exposure. Miss Donovan sought preservation and found destruction. We merely observed the collision and directed the debris toward the appropriate authorities. Still, it feels like a waste. Tommy, Claire, the club. All gone because someone wanted easy money. Nothing is wasted if it instructs. We have learned again that secrets are volatile commodities, that fear is a poor foundation for stability, and that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually collapse under their own weight. He took a sip of brandy and closed his eyes. The Copper Lounge will reopen. Music will play. People will gather to listen, to drink, to forget their troubles for a few hours. The cycle continues, indifferent to individual tragedies. That is both the cruelty and the mercy of existence. I looked at my desk where Tommy's notebook had rested for those crucial hours. It was evidence in a federal vault now, but for a brief time it had been the most dangerous object in New York. Outside, somewhere in the village, a trumpet player was warming up for a late set. The notes drifting out into the cool night air. Life went on, messy and beautiful and persistent. "Good night, Archie," Wolfe said, rising from his chair. "Good night, sir." The elevator door closed on another completed chapter. Tomorrow, undoubtedly, the phone would ring again with someone else's crisis, someone else's secrets demanding attention. But tonight, the brownstone was quiet. The case was closed, and the music played on. 3 weeks after the case closed, I was at my desk sorting through the mail when an envelope caught my attention. Heavy cream paper, expensive stationery, addressed to Nero Wolfe in elegant handwriting. I opened it and found a brief note from Leonard Marsh. The grand reopening of Tommy's place was scheduled for Friday evening, and we were invited as guests of honor. Leonard had written that the band wanted to thank us properly and that they had commissioned a new composition in Tommy's memory. The note concluded with an observation that Tommy would have appreciated the irony of being memorialized by the people he had been blackmailing. Wolfe read the invitation, with his usual distaste for leaving the brownstone, but something in his expression suggested he was considering acceptance. "Friday evening," he said, "that would require missing dinner. Fritz could pack something, cold chicken, bread, cheese. You wouldn't starve." He grimaced at the barbarism of portable meals, but didn't immediately refuse, which I took as progress. By Thursday he had accepted, stipulating that we would arrive at 9 and depart by 11, giving him minimal exposure to crowds and noise. Friday evening found us in a taxi heading downtown, Wolfe occupying most of the back seat and radiating disapproval of the entire enterprise. The village streets were alive with their usual Friday energy. People spilling from restaurants and bars, the sound of competing music drifting from open doorways. Tommy's place had been transformed. The interior was freshly painted. New lighting softened the atmosphere, and photographs of Tommy lined one wall, showing him at various stages of his career. The stage had been expanded slightly, and the sound system upgraded. Paul Hendricks greeted us at the door, looking healthier than when I'd last seen him. The weight of false accusation finally lifted. "Mr. Wolfe, thank you for coming. We saved you the best table, away from the speakers." He led us to a corner position that offered observation without immersion, exactly what Wolfe would have chosen himself. The band took the stage at 9:30, Leonard at piano, Iris on saxophone, a new trumpet player whose name I didn't catch, and the rhythm section holding everything together. They opened with a standard, something safe and familiar to warm up the crowd. But the second number was different, slower and more contemplative, with harmonies that suggested careful composition rather than improvisation. Iris stepped to the microphone. "This is called The Last Note. We wrote it for Tommy Farrell, who taught us that every performance might be your final one, so you had better make it count." The piece unfolded with the kind of emotional honesty that only comes from genuine feeling. Leonard's piano work was delicate and precise. Iris's saxophone sang with controlled passion, and the new trumpet player handled the melody with respect for the man he was replacing. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, just honest music played by people who understood loss. When they finished, the applause was sustained and genuine. I glanced at Wolfe and saw something unexpected in his expression, a softness that suggested the music had reached him despite his usual defenses. During the break, the band joined us at our table. Leonard looked exhausted but satisfied, the kind of tiredness that comes from meaningful work rather than mere labor. "That was beautiful," I said. "Tommy would have been proud." "Tommy would have tried to sell it for $1,000, Iris said with a sad smile. "But maybe he would have been proud too, underneath all the scheming." Paul brought champagne and we toasted to absent friends and new beginnings. The conversation stayed light, avoiding the darkness that had brought us together. These people had survived betrayal and murder and false accusation, and they had chosen to rebuild rather than scatter. That took a particular kind of courage. As we prepared to leave, Leonard approached Wolfe with obvious nervousness. "I wanted to thank you properly for proving my innocence. I know I paid Tommy to hide my past, but you could have exposed everything anyway. You didn't have to show discretion. Your past crimes were irrelevant to the murder investigation," Wolfe said. "I have no interest in punishment for its own sake, only in justice where justice is warranted." Outside, the October air had turned cold, carrying the promise of winter. We walked to the corner to hail a taxi, and I noticed Wolfe pausing to look back at the club. Music drifted from the open door, the sound of people choosing joy over grief. "Satisfactory conclusion?" I asked, echoing my question from weeks earlier. "More satisfactory than most," he admitted. "The guilty were punished, the innocent were freed, and something worthwhile emerged from the wreckage. Music survived the musician's failings, which suggests hope for humanity despite considerable evidence to the contrary." The taxi arrived, and we settled in for the ride home. Wolfe sat in uncharacteristic silence, perhaps still hearing the melody of Tommy's memorial. The case had begun with murder and blackmail, had expanded to include federal crimes and suicide, and had concluded with a jazz composition played by survivors. Not the ending anyone would have predicted, but somehow the right one. Back at the brownstone, Fritz had kept dinner warm despite the late hour. We ate in the dining room, Wolfe's mood improving with each course. The familiar rituals of home reasserted themselves, pushing the evening's emotions back into proper perspective. Later, in the office with brandy and silence, Wolfe offered his final observation on the case. Mr. Farrell collected secrets as currency, believing information was power. He failed to understand that power without wisdom is merely danger waiting to manifest. His notebook destroyed him and everyone connected to it. Yet from that destruction came music, which is humanity's preferred method of transforming pain into beauty. An adequate trade, all things considered. I raised my glass in agreement. The case was closed, the music played on, and tomorrow would bring new problems requiring attention. But tonight, justice had been served and art had survived, which was about as much as anyone could reasonably expect from a world that specialized in disappointment. The yellow cattleya still bloomed on Wolfe's desk, serene and perfect, untouched by human complications. Outside, the city continued its endless symphony of ambition and failure, hope and despair. And in a basement club in the village, a trumpet player hit the final note of the evening, letting it hang in the air before releasing it to silence.